think it's all working. Cool.
Cool. So are you ready to go? We're right on 2. Shall we just
I think we might as well, and then that clock will be accurate.
Yeah, good.
Nice.
Okay, welcome everyone. We've got Ted Henniker who's going to give us a progress review presentation. Over to you, Ted.
Lovely. I'll just see if I can hide all this stuff off the screen. There is a way to get rid of this one, I don't remember. All right, so I might look at this screen, that'll be better.
Oh, you're mic'd up.
Yeah, so this is my microphone, and then I'm using this microphone as well.
Yeah.
I'll just talk loudly.
Yeah, good, sorry.
Deb, send a message if you struggle to hear anything. All right, so this presentation is on the topic of evaluating Ziva Kunda's 1990 theory of motivated reasoning. All right, so just a quick recap, a refresher on my project. So for Progress Review 1 last year, I spoke about this idea of irrationality being my explanandum, and we had a bit of conversation about that as well. And I gave an example from Alfred Meal, the philosopher, who said people who falsely believe in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary that their spouses are not having affairs, that their children are not using illicit drugs, or that they themselves are not seriously ill. And we had a little bit of discussion about whether that's even a good example or whatever. But I basically said at that time that irrationality was just a placeholder term while I figure out exactly the phenomenon I'm actually chasing here. This year, I've done some of that work to tighten the scope, I am pleased to report, and I now have a much more specific explanandum. So I'll illustrate that with a case study. So here's the case study. Approximately 1/3 of US registered voters still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. More politically knowledgeable Trump voters are in fact more likely, not less likely, to believe this. But Vinnick, Nazaire, Jones and Wager, which is the hardest 3 names to pronounce, apart from Jones, that's easy. They surveyed 1,642 Americans during the vote count and also after the vote count. And they tested for fraud belief updates given hypothetical election outcomes. So they were actually, they were talking to these people as the votes were rolling in, and they were choosing the swing states off 538, and they were modifying them and giving them the maps and saying, hey, here's the results, and seeing how they responded to that. And here are a couple of those maps that they were giving people. On the right here is an image that shows the prior and the posterior fraud beliefs, so following the presentation of the hypothetical maps. So Democrats and Republicans there for each scenario. Now, election fraud beliefs doubled following the hypothetical loss that they were given and halved following a win. So people were saying, there's no fraud here if their candidate won, and if their candidate lost, there's fraud at about double and half the rate. There is one exception here for Republicans following a loss due to a ceiling effect. So everybody who could think that was a credible explanation already believed it. This data aligns nicely with Pennycook and Rand's 2021 finding as well, that about 65% of Republicans believed that the election was stolen when Biden won it. So what about all of this? This doubling and halving is quantitative evidence of what the authors here are calling desirability effects. That's the idea that subjects' beliefs seem to be affected by their desires, in this case represented by their favoured candidate. Psychologists repeatedly observe wishful thinking when they're studying human reasoning. That is to say, we are more likely to believe the things that we wish to be true. Now, this seems irrational, but not every explanation for it is actually involving irrationality. Such desirability effects have been extensively documented, and so my aim here is to evaluate and build upon existing explanations or theories of this phenomenon. I want to figure out what why people believe to some degree whatever they want to. That's why I'm looking at what other people have to say about these ideas. So in chapter 1, I looked at von Hippel and Trivers' 2011 theory that self-deception is biologically adaptive, and I found that that was full of errors. And in chapter 2, I'm evaluating Kunda's theory of motivated reasoning. And that's just briefly the idea that human reasoning has an inbuilt bias towards drawing self-serving conclusions. And just a note here that these theorists don't use the term desirability effects. They are pretty much grappling with the same phenomenon though. So von Hippel and Trivers talk about people believing falsehood because of a desire for their truth. Kunda ponders why people are more likely to believe the things that they wish to be true. So I showed this slide last year, but it's just here again to guide the discussion today. The idea that there's this theory crisis in psychology where psychologists are treating each other's theories a bit like toothbrushes, no self-respecting person wanting to use anybody else's. So theory construction methodology here was created in response to that. We have 5 steps, and we can use this for theory evaluation as well. So we'll go through these steps. So step 1, identify the relevant phenomenon. We've got desirability effects. That's the idea of people believing to some degree whatever they want to. Step 2 is to formulate a proto-theory, so we can just put the motivated theory of reasoning in here. Step 3 is to formalize the theory and the phenomenon into the model, and this is where it gets a bit more tricky. So we have to accurately reconstruct the argument to do this. That's the hard part. So last year I spoke about what I called syllogistic decomposition. That's not a thing. These methods already exist. They're called argument reconstruction, argument mapping, argument analysis. So that's what we're going to use. So an argument, for anyone who doesn't know, is a block of informal logic composed of premises and a conclusion. And then you can have a chain argument where you have multiple arguments in a row and the conclusions can get fed in again to become premises for the chain of arguments. Argument reconstruction is taking a theory, so a paper for example, and converting it into constituent arguments. This should be able to be replicated. You should in principle be able to get a computer to do this, but the trouble is that human language, natural language is very ambiguous. So what we have to do is charitable interpretation. So present the best possible form of the argument. And this book here, Critical Thinking, The Basics, which I picked up recently, has very good examples of argument reconstruction in it. And then we can make argument maps, which look something like this out of the chain arguments. So here I have 2 separate maps, one for the theory on the left and one for the mechanism on the right, because her paper includes conversation about both. Now there are far too many premises. You saw how complex those maps are for me to talk about in this time, but I'll just give a quick selection of conclusions. And just to start with is a couple of quick definitions. So accuracy goals, that's where people are motivated to reason so as to accurately figure out what's real. That's pretty much the idea, like scientific thinking. And then directional goals is any other kind of reasoning. So accuracy goals, her third conclusion, she says accuracy goals are leading to both deeper and more careful processing. She also says accuracy goals do not always reduce biases. They can in fact sometimes exacerbate them. The fifth conclusion she comes to is that people are aware of a trade-off between accuracy and effort, and they select strategies by considering both the costs and the benefits to those. Her sixth conclusion is that when people are motivated to be accurate, they expend more cognitive effort on issue-related reasoning, attend to relevant information more carefully, and process it more deeply. She also says that directional goals in reasoning bias the accessing and construction of beliefs about the world in a self-serving direction. She says they bias the use of inferential rules and statistical heuristics in the same direction, of the evaluation of scientific evidence as well in the same direction. And her net conclusion there is that directional goals bias reasoning towards self-serving conclusions. So she says the biasing role of goals is actually constrained also by the ability to construct a justification for the desired conclusion. So there is a constraint on that. Her 12th conclusion, she says people motivated to arrive at a particular conclusion, that is your directional goals, attempt to be objective. They try to construct a justification of their desired conclusion that would persuade a dispassionate observer. But she says the objectivity of this justification construction process is illusory. People maintain an illusion of objectivity, in other words, when motivated to arrive at a particular conclusion. So in total, she says accuracy strategies are tending towards accurate beliefs, directional strategies don't. And therefore, we should understand reasoning as being of 2 different types, accuracy and directionally motivated. And then her final conclusion for her theory is that directionally motivated reasoning is the best explanation for desirability effects. That is why people are more likely to arrive at conclusions that they want to arrive at. She obviously doesn't use the term desirability effects, but she does say that last part. Now for the mechanism. She says that cognitive processes are playing a major role, but an incomplete role in producing these self-serving biases. That prior knowledge is accessed in the process of arriving at desired conclusions, but not all relevant prior knowledge. That the constraints imposed on self-serving biases by that prior knowledge indicate biased memory search processes. That directional goals enhance the accessibility of those knowledge structures that are consistent with desired conclusions. She says that there's converging evidence from literature on the self-serving biases that is best explained by biased memory search, and that mechanisms underlying motivated reasoning are not yet fully understood. So just a sort of proviso there. So then finally she introduces the biased accessing and construction model, as she calls it, which is the idea that motivated reasoning is mediated by biased memory search and biased belief construction. The next slide is the last slide in terms of rebuilding her argument, and that's bringing in the idea of confirmation bias, which we're probably all familiar with. So she says people are either not aware of their tendency to favour hypothesis-consistent evidence, that is, confirmation bias, or they judge this strategy to be acceptable. That hypothesis confirmation seems to be explained by a spontaneous confirmatory searching mechanism, and then she brings the idea of confirmation bias and the idea of directionally motivated reasoning together and says that they appear to be both caused by comparable or parallel biased memory search processes. Her final conclusion in the mechanism space is a hedge of sorts. She says there are three possible explanations for how the bias search arises. Either we ask a directional question and then confirmation bias takes over and does the rest. We ask a series of questions, same deal. Or on top of both of those, motivation is also intensifying that confirmation bias in some way. So a summary of everything we've just said there is, why are people more likely to believe the things they wish to be true? Ziva Kunda is saying because of directionally motivated reasoning. My summary of that, if I'm just explaining it to someone in an elevator pitch, is the idea that conflicts of interest, emotional, social, financial, political, whatever, bias us towards arriving at and rationalising self-serving conclusions. That is also the idea that there are two different types of reasoning here. So reasoning can be split into these two different paths with different underlying mechanisms. So to explain the source of the bias, she introduces this bias accessing and construction model informed by research on confirmation bias. So this to me is a really interesting idea, is the idea that our expectations and our desires are biasing our reasoning in a very similar manner, and probably even by the same cognitive mechanisms. Last thing to say about this is, because we're still on step 3 of the theory construction methodology stuff, we just need to check in terms of modelling things that there aren't any logical holes and stuff, so we can sort of start jumping into the analysis a little bit. Now, this is where I'm up to in the project. So these are preliminary results. So C7, she says that directional goals are biasing the accessing and the construction of beliefs about the world in a self-serving direction. Just a sort of semantic issue I have with this is the idea of directional goals. I think that's an ambiguous idea because the motive of accuracy, I think, could still be seen as a form of directionally motivated reasoning. That is a motivation in the direction of accuracy. And I think if we want to minimise ambiguity, we should probably give it a better name. But that's just a semantic sort of nitpick. Cognition with inaccurate intent would be a technically precise description. Freud just called it rationalisation. I don't even see why we couldn't just use that. C14 is people maintaining an illusion of objectivity when they're motivated to arrive at a particular conclusion. Now, an interesting implication here is that it isn't possible to be motivated to reach a particular conclusion and also reason objectively. Well, it depends how you interpret what she's saying here, but if you just strictly interpret it, that is what she's saying. That seems incorrect because there would be cases where you could be pursuing both motivations at once and coincidentally arrive at the same situation. I said on a game show you might get a financial reward, for example, for getting the correct answer, and so you've got a directional motivation and an accuracy motivation potentially working at the same time. And there are surely cases where conflicts of interest don't create those perverse outcomes where it's not actually an illusion of objectivity. C17, she says directionally motivated reasoning best explains desirability effects. Why is the people are more likely to arrive at those conclusions they want to. There are actually cases, though, where desirability effects are can be explained purely by Bayesian updating on polarized priors. So the study I gave earlier about the US election is actually an example of that. So that paper, what they were doing, they collected the before data and they collected the after data. And they attempted to generate the after data using the before data. And they found that if they included a formalization of directionally motivated reasoning in there, they actually reduced the accuracy of their fit, which surprised me a lot. So what they did instead is they just modeled rational Bayesian updating. So given the pre-existing information, which they've also got in there, which is that a lot of people already believed that fraud was a likely, well, Republicans specifically, a lot of them already believed that fraud was a likely possibility, then if that's the information space you're coming from, it can be rational to update in a direction that's completely different to where the Democrats are coming from, for example. I don't think this is a slam dunk refutation of Kunda's theory, and they say this explicitly in their limitations section. They say it doesn't actually explain where those polarized priors have come from to begin with, but it is a big asterisk on the conclusion. So my final slide here, Kunda posits the existence of a hypothesis desirability bias inherent to human reasoning, which is very similar to the idea of hypothesis confirmation bias. So our desires and our expectations are biasing our reasoning in similar ways. I think the theory seems workable so far, but there are a few reservations, and we went through those just a moment ago. So directional goals, confusing choice of terminology. Illusion of objectivity is not always an illusion. Even a stopwatch is right twice a day. That's probably pedantic though, as I said. And rational updating on polarized priors is surprisingly effective at explaining real-world irrationality. Maybe echo chambers, good old echo chambers, are the predominant cause of false and irrational belief formation in the population, for example. So still to do for me here is to finish off steps 4 and 5 of the theory construction stuff for this theory. But that's where I am at the moment with the project. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Ted. We've got time for some questions. So we've got a question.
Can I just ask about that last one? I mean, it seems pretty weak, that study. I mean, in the sense that, for just the reason you said, I mean, you want to immediately go back to how they came to their beliefs about why the election was stolen and that was fought in the first place.
So are you referring to this slide?
Yeah.
Yep.
This one. The bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, if you've already got a belief that there's fraud there, then it will be rational to update, to use that belief. But you'd want to look at the whole process, wouldn't you? I mean, that just seems...
Yeah, exactly.
It just doesn't seem like it's... I mean, I don't know if it's just even prima facie evidence against...
Yep.
I think at this point, until they've done that and said, okay, we've done it for the prior stuff, and applied goodness to the prior stuff, and we found it to be wanting for these reasons. But at the moment, I'm not seeing it. Am I missing something?
Yeah, this study was really interesting. I mean, it surprised me a lot when I came across it too, for similar reasons. And not only that, but they framed it in their abstract and in their introduction as a slam dunk refutation of Ziva Kunda's theory. And then I got through it, and I was like, well, okay, but where did these priors come from? And then they say in sort of fine print, this is in Nature Human Behaviour, and then in sort of fine print at the bottom they say, oh yeah, but we haven't explained where these priors are coming from. And I'm like, well, then it's not a slam dunk of the theory, is it? It is in a good journal, and they've got a lot of data there. Like, they have to tick off a lot to publish in Nature, so they've got a lot of they've got a big appendix going through how all their algorithms, how they got there, and so on.
Sure, precision there. But
yeah. Yeah. So I think it's maybe a marketing choice. I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky one there. I agree, though.
I just don't see it until they do the prior stuff. It looks like the desirability effects started earlier on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, why are people choosing to watch Fox or whatever rather than watching some other media or something? How do you explain that precisely?
Can Deb hear that?
Oh, do we need the microphone to...
Deb, Jason's just... Peter's just checking if you can hear everything okay.
It's a little faint in the audience, but I could hear Julie.
Ah, lovely. We'll hand the microphone around for any further questions.
Can I just jump in with a clarificatory point?
Absolutely.
Just trying to get Kunda's view right in my head, what she means. So let's say I like golf, and I'm convinced that golf courses are positive for climate change, whether they are or not.
You'd like that to be the case.
Yeah, let's say. And so this claim about is it like bias towards memories bit? Is that like, so I'm having a discussion with someone about this, and I start arguing about why they're positive for climate change, and I can selectively remember all of the positive arguments, but somehow it just takes me longer to access the negative arguments. Is that the general structure of what's going on, or is it?
That's pretty close to it. So I've got the slide here that's relevant to this. So you can see C7, C8, and C9. She's saying that if you've got these goals, you're going to have biased accessing and construction of beliefs about the world, biased use of inferential rules and statistical heuristics, and then biased evaluation of scientific evidence. So cherry picking and all the rest of it is going to go on. And I guess what she's saying is, and there's probably an open question, can you train this out of yourself?
Yeah.
I mean, scientists are in the business of doing that if they're good at what they do, if they have integrity. But I guess what she's saying with this is, if you really want it to be the case that golf is like good for climate change, for example, you'll use what's available to you to try to construct a justification of that desired conclusion that would persuade a dispassionate observer, as she puts it here, so as to maintain this illusion of objectivity for yourself, so that you feel as though you've made a convincing claim. Your side of the argument's just as valid as anybody else's, and so on and so forth. And I guess this shows up in journalism too, with this myth of objectivity in journalism, where they could platform somebody like, I don't know, Malcolm Roberts or someone who has like 2 followers, and put those ideas on the same sort of pedestal as, you know, the scientific consensus, for example. But there are limits, she says, as well, to how far that can go, because you have to be able to, where does she say it? There's a constraint, that's right, at the bottom, C11. Constrained by the ability to construct that justification that seems reasonable. So when the evidence gets too overwhelming, it all breaks down. But it's kind of this flexibility to reasoning that I think she's positing here. And yeah, the mechanism is basically selective interpretation, selective forgetting, selective inference, all that.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks.
It seems to be mistaken. It's not just the memory. It seems to be you can have mistaken inferences as well.
Yes.
You don't get the inferences correct as well.
Yeah, okay.
You know, so that one, the one that you were saying there was the accessing, but then there's the construction of the beliefs, and that ties into the CA. That is, you get the rules wrong. I mean, so you actually that's another way you can do it, is wrong reasoning. Insane in some sense. I mean, that's a bit of the C9 is a version of A in some sense.
And I guess it's an open question to what degree, say, critical thinking education, the cognitive dissonance of knowing that you've got the rules wrong, to what extent that actually changes the way people do this. I guess that's an open question.
And it comes back to something that we've talked about before, in terms of a lot of this is bounded to the belief itself, and not to the kind of, I'm using my terminology from my world, about the kind of metacognitive layer that exists around this, which is, this is my personal epistemology and my way of understanding how knowledge works. So if you're trying to change my mind on something and you're just coming at me straight from the belief, I'm like, no, well, I have a completely different belief system about how knowledge works, and I'm just not going to engage with that. Which was always the problem that we had when we were looking at stuff around climate change and vaccine and all of that sort of thing. It's like, you can tell people about the belief and try and address that till you blow in the face. It's not going to change their mind until you get it. Well, how would you actually understand how knowledge works?
Yep, agree.
Ted, in this view, it seems like if you go all the way back to Kahneman and Tversky's work, you've got that notion that what we seek above everything else is not so much accuracy but coherence.
Yep.
And that, prize can be explained a little bit, even the derivation of prize can be explained in some way towards the search for coherence. And given a world of enormous complexity where what we know is a small part of it, but we still have to create some kind of narrative that makes sense to us, that inevitably we will be missing things. Construct a narrative that in some way is accurate. It's probably true for all of us. So I'm wondering about how you see that role of just seeking and indeed maintaining coherence as a part of this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this is very much related to this stuff about the confirmation bias and the expectations. Because if you're modelling the world in a certain way, then you will have certain expectancies that come out of that. And I found it really fascinating reading through her paper and reading the studies she's citing to come to these conclusions. Like how strong the confirmation bias is. I mean, I was aware of it before, but really looking into it, yeah, expectations are a massive... Like, it's very funny. I mean, just bring it back to the US election because it's such a valuable gold mine for this kind of work. It was really funny in the recent election how everyone just got it very wrong. All these people got it very wrong and were just like, whoa, really surprised. And one of the things with learning that we know as well is that surprise is like a massive... It's really relevant to memory, what's the word? Like, yeah, error correction and memory formation, all the rest of it as well. And that learning is often best when surprises are involved because I think expectation and coherence is key.
It's a prediction error.
Prediction error, that's right. So it's really interesting seeing the convergence of these two disparate streams of research, in the stream of research into prediction error and then the stream of research into the role of motivation in reasoning in this paper. That was really cool, I thought.
Just before the half-hour mark, just want to give one last chance to our audience if they want to ask a question. You don't have to, but if you...
A softball. No.
I've like half thought of one, but I can't really put it, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Last 10 later.
Cool. All right, well, let's all thank you.
Did Deb have a question?
Oh, we've got a chance.
Well, I can talk to Deb later. No worries.
Okay, so audience members, thanks very much.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Job done. And then we'll get a chance to chat with the panel and the advisors.
Lovely. Thank you. See you.